On this podcast, I think one of the things that we do fairly well is we try to maybe pull back the lens a little bit and maybe look at these topics from the 30,000 foot view, right? Or at least that's something that I try to do.
I think we get there in our best
we get there
days.
roundabout, right? And one of the things I wanted to take a look at is just the science of diversity in general. So I reached out to Dr. Mona Sue Weissmark. She's a clinical and social psychologist whose work focuses on diversity and justice in particular. And she's also a visiting professor of psychology at Harvard and the author of the upcoming book, The Science of Diversity. I spoke to her about how when we often think about diversity, we're not seeing the whole picture or we're thinking about it in the wrong way. Dr. Weissmark, you've made a career out of studying diversity and justice. I'm curious to get your take on, I guess, the concept of diversity as we know it today.
I think there's a history, let's say going back until the 1960s, that corporate America felt that they started to have to begin diversity training programs. And in part, now that's a $10 billion or more business. They had to focus on compliance, on legal requirements, and avoiding lawsuits. So when people think of diversity to this day, they think of what began in the 1960s, this compliance diversity training, which really had this legal focus and more of, some people call it the check-off box approach. And then there would be mandatory diversity trainings, again, all with the focus on compliance and legal requirements. And I think diversity became a big word then. And then there was this agenda, the notion that, okay, we have to get our managers in corporate America to appreciate diversity. I'd say that in the 70s and 80s, that kind of diversity training went a little bit into sensitivity training. And now not only are we going to comply with the law, we're going to get force, I think is mandatory, have people take these trainings so they're sensitive to it. I'm not criticizing this, by the way. I'm just describing how you asked how did diversity become popular, so to speak. And so I think it was more institutionalized, so to speak.
So how should we be looking at these sorts of issues?
If you're really focused on the science of diversity method, you're focused on teaching people to take conflicting findings and make sense of them and evaluate the information and judge the information. And that's very different from cherry picking. So, and this is really helpful in our society today where so many topics are polarized. For example, just take, if you look at the topic of discrimination, and I'm giving you one example. The Pew did some studies looking at polarized views of a sample of about 8,000 random people. And they found, for example, if you ask Americans, what do you think about discrimination? Does it really sort of exist when it comes to discrimination? And you'll find polarized opinions. Republicans, just using political parties, but they've done it in many topics, about 80% of Republicans say people who say they're discriminated against are exaggerating. They're seeing it where it doesn't exist. The other hand, the exact same number, about 78% of Democrats say the problem is people do not recognize discrimination. Can take so many topics like this and show the polarization. So what we do in our classes and in our consultations is we take these kind of polarizing topics, we teach people the method of thinking scientifically, and that enables them to evaluate both sets of information.
Most of the time, though, we're talking about some very deeply held, ingrained beliefs. Where do these biases come from?
And that really begins, believe it or not, at birth. There's biological evidence that we become very attached to what's familiar to us, beginning in the womb, to the voice of our mothers. There's been studies done showing that we have a preference for our mother's voice versus a stranger's voice. That just develops. We have attachments. We have needs. We want to belong. We know this is very important. And then we have an identity. It's not just some personal background with objective facts. That personal background comes from your family and informs your views and beliefs. And so we become very attached to that. All the great scientists, Feynman, Einstein, Marie Curie, they kept emphasizing that the scientific way of thinking is so important because it allows one to gain awareness into their own thinking. If you use scientific thinking, you have to see both hypotheses in your mind to move forward. So let's take gender. Let's assume you're gay, for example, and you think if gay marriages are great and gay parents can be just as effective or better as gay parents, right? And you have strong emotions about that because your identity is wrapped up with being gay. It would be very hard for you to have a conversation with someone who says, you know what, I think gay parents do not make good parents. What we would do in class or in our consultations is actually look at the conflicting studies. There are a lot of studies that have examined this question. And mostly in psychology, studies have conflicting findings. It is very hard. Sometimes maybe there's been 90 studies and they all agree, but generally they conflict. So how do you make sense of both sets of data? And having people be able to evaluate the information, the conflicting data, helps, back to your question again, for you to become aware more of your emotional response.
In your work, how have you been able to get these, I guess, diametrically opposed groups together? And what are the results of these conversations?
The studies that I did looked at polarized groups. And exactly to your point, groups that have a history and memories and legacies that inform their views. And we looked at what happens when you bring these groups together. It's no different than looking at any other polarized groups, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. In our case, we looked at polarized groups in the sense that they were polarized historically speaking, right? Children of survivors and children of Nazis, children of slaves, descendants of slaves and descendants of slave owners, where the emotional legacy is really great. And then we looked at how is that legacy transmitted? How do they form these strong opinions about the other? And could they, in the presence of the other, hear the other side? In this case, we weren't teaching them the scientific method, right? They didn't have the tools that we have now to teach people to have polarized discussions. But we were just looking from a research point of view. What happens when you bring them together? Can they see the other side? To what extent do their emotional backgrounds, legacies, personal histories influence their views of the others? And I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to hear that it had a tremendous impact in being able to have an open dialogue and hearing the other. Even many generations removed, in the case of children of slaves and slave owners. So what was transmitted to them had an impact on who they were and how they felt about the other side, even though they weren't alive during these historical incidents. That's why you cannot just surgically remove, shall we say, biases or opinions from people, because it's who they are and it's been transmitted. And that's why the science of diversity method is so needed and so valuable in situations where people have these strong emotional ties.